If you're a student in a public speaking class and your instructor has assigned you some kind of literature reading, or if you have watched some speech activity where someone has been using a little black binder, this tutorial will help you understand what you're looking at. So the first part of this tutorial, the second part will be published later, is really about the genres of literature, and this is from a forensics perspective. So when you're a competitor and you're trying to choose, what event do you want to do and how do you go about looking for material, this will help you understand the classifications of literature. So the first classification then is, there's three genres of literature. The first classification is what's called prose interpretation, and prose really is subdivided into two categories. The first category is fiction, which refers to short stories, novels, like I have here. J.R.R. Tolkien's work would be considered fiction. And one of the ways in which you can tell that it's prose is that the narrator is present as either a first person, second person, or third person point of view. Depends on the writer how they're going to do that. But essentially it's a story that's told that doesn't necessarily have, it's not autobiographical or biographical. It's something that's meant to be in some kind of imaginary universe. So that's the first distinction with prose. The second type of prose is what's called nonfiction, and this includes diaries, letters, journal entries, Yelp reviews, Facebook posts, textbooks with words. Anything that's written in sentences and paragraphs essentially would be considered nonfiction prose, and of course autobiographies and biographies would also fall under that category. So those are the two basic categories. One is not necessarily more effective than the other, and it kind of depends on what you like to read. So if you're a person that likes to read fiction, then that may be a good starting point for you. So the next category then, the next genre is poetry. Now, there's different ways to define poetry. One way is to say it has some kind of rhythm or rhyme. In other words, there's some kind of patterning that you can hear when you speak it out loud or when you read it on the page. I think a second definition, which I think is really probably appropriate, is that poetry can look funny on a page. There is something called prose poetry, which is essentially written in paragraphs, but usually poetry has shorter lines. It might be that the words on the page make some kind of illustration. So basically it looks funny on a page. So using that definition, if you look at a phone book, for example, a phone book looks funny on the page, and by definition then would be a kind of poetry. You could certainly read the phone book. There's a certain rhythm and rhyme to all of that because you've got the numbers, you've got the names. That would be poetry. However, for the most part, I wouldn't add a phone book into a poetry program. So poetry then would be anything that's published in print, of which there are, volumes and volumes and volumes that you can look through. Poetry is as old as the language itself. You can also look at actual performances, like poetry slams, for example. If you go to YouTube, you're going to find a whole list of different kinds of poems that have been performed, and they're meant to be performed in that regard. Song lyrics also technically would be considered a kind of poetry because, of course, you've got a rhythm and a rhyme in there. There is a challenge of using lyrics. I mean, they can work really well if you want to sing through parts of your poetry program. If you have a good singing voice, that's sometimes a nice little feature there. But one of the cautions with using lyrics is that if the judge knows the song really well, then he or she is probably going to have that song in their head, and then it becomes more about the song that they're listening to and less about the lyrics as they relate to your program. So for the most part, I'm not going to say you shouldn't do them at all, but I would be a little bit cautious about using poetry and how much poetry do you actually need to use. Maybe very little, just for effect, is going to be fine. Then we come to the third genre of literature, which is drama interp. Now, drama doesn't refer to tone. It refers to the actual genre itself, and drama is meant to be spoken. It's really the only genre that's meant to be performed out loud, of course, with the exception of epic poems and other kinds of poetry, and poetry slams are also meant to be performed out loud. But generally, I think this is a good way to kind of gauge what's in a book like Lord of the Rings and any other book that you read is not meant to be performed out loud. Drama is, and usually there's some suggestions from the writer, the playwright, as to how to read that particular piece. But know that with regard to poetry, there's no hard line on this one. There are some poems that are meant that the oral tradition is very strong, and the poetic devices help people remember those long poems. So it's not that poetry is not supposed to be performed out loud, but drama definitely is. One of the ways in which you can tell drama is that there's an absence of a narrator, either in a third person point of view, could also be first person or second person point of view. In other words, you're simply seeing the character. You're not seeing a narrator who's really the mediator between the piece and the audience. You're just seeing the actual characters themselves. So that may be kind of a clue for you as to what might be dramatic material. So going into those categories then, anything that's a stage play would be considered drama. It's meant to be performed, and that's why you've got the playwrights blocking suggestions within that. Radio scripts or any kind of podcast, for example, also meant to be performed out loud, not meant to be read silently. Certainly anything, any TV program, anything that's on Netflix, any series that you watch, that came to the actors as a script. And so, again, that would be considered drama interp and not prose. Finally, stand-up comedians. Comedy routines are also considered drama because, of course, a comedy routine is meant to be performed out loud unless you're looking at someone's written satire, which then would be prose. So again, there's always some variations here that I probably don't need to get into at this point in time. But just knowing these basic categories is helpful. So anything from any stand-up comedian. I have Patton Oswalt here as one example of a comedian. Beautiful work, works really well as a performance. And finally, any speeches that have been done. So any presidential speeches, any other speeches that anybody has ever given. Academy Award speeches, for example, would be considered drama because they weren't meant to be read silently. They were meant to be spoken out loud. So that would be, I think, probably the best thing to think about is this something that people have spoken out loud? Is it meant to be performed in front of an audience, or is it meant to be read silently? Okay, so that would probably be a good distinction there.